Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth Human Lunchtime. Thank you so much for coming. My name's Sophie. I'm a fourth-year student at Collingwood. I study natural sciences, and it's my pleasure to be able to welcome you on behalf of Durham Christian Union to Human. Human is a week of events that we're putting on where we're investigating questions of life, questions of faith, and questions of humanity and what it means to us to be human. Today, we're going to be looking at this question of individual. Won't God rob me of my freedom? So I'm going to invite up Pete. I'd love you to join us. Thanks, Pete. So I've been thinking today about what makes me individual, what makes each of you guys individual. For me, I do quite normal things. I enjoy watching films. I enjoy going on the river in a rowing boat. I also do slightly more random things. I enjoy playing chess. I'm a member of the Durham University Bridge Society. So I'm basically a grandma in training, but you know. Pete, could you tell us a little bit, what do you do in your free time?
Yeah, I've got two little boys and they take up quite a lot of my free time. But there are some other things as well. For one of my university holidays, I worked as a sports journalist in the run-up to one of the Olympic Games. So I love watching all sports, especially Olympic sport. And then I have basically a pathological allergic reaction to cooking the same thing twice. So I love finding different recipes and inflicting them on all and sundry. Nice,
thanks. I'm meant to be cooking dinner for my house tonight, and I have no idea what I'm going to cook, so I might ask you for ideas later. Yeah. Thank you. Cool. Guys, thank you so much for being with us. It's great to have you here, particularly if you've been here with us all week. Thank you. Also, if it's your first time, you are so welcome. Couple of notices from me. If you need the loo, it's out the doors where you came out, and then just round to the right. Also, if there's a fire, which we hope there won't be, there's two exits in the cafe at the back, there's two exits at the back of the marquee, and there's an exit to my left here. So please just, make your way out quickly and then follow the guys in the human jumpers. Otherwise, just to run through what we're going to do, I'm going to hand over to Pete, who's going to speak to us on this question for about 20 minutes. Then we'll have a time of Q&A. So if you've got any questions during the talk, please do text them in to the number which is on the screen behind me, and we'll have a time of Q&A. We'll finish about 10 to 2 so that you guys can get away to lectures if you want to, but then we'll continue after that for more questions, so you're really welcome to stay. For the moment, I'm going to hand over to Pete. Thanks.
Thanks, Sophie. Terrific. Lovely to see you here. Love to see some familiar faces, and I think some not so familiar faces. So if it's your first time here, particular welcome to you. This week, you probably picked up, we're considering what it means to be human, and today we're considering the question of individual, won't God rob me of my freedom? The desire for freedom is probably a universal desire that all humans feel, and certainly that's true within our culture, isn't it? Freedom is considered one of the essential aspects to experiencing humanity, and our movies and songs keep telling us that. We're going to draw quite heavily on them today. Here, for example, are the lyrics of the most popular song played at British funerals. It closes like this: "For what is a man? What has he got? If not himself, then he has naught. To say the things he truly feels are not the words of one who kneels. The records show I took the blows and did it my way." Now, what is Frank saying? What's Frank saying? He's saying this: if you want to know true freedom, then you must be yourself. If you're one of those who kneels, if you're not yourself, he says, you've got naught, you've got nothing. And I guess it's how many of us would want to live on our lives. Sure, I lived my life as a free person. I lived for myself. No one told me how to live. I'm an individual. I did it my way. That's why so many people choose it for their funeral. Now, it was sung in 1968, and that's really interesting because at that time, there were a couple of big shifts that were happening within broader, particularly Western culture, when it came to thinking about freedom and when it came to thinking about individuality. Let me just outline what those two shifts were for you. You'll be really familiar with them. The first shift was in how we thought about human identity, and that shifted from thinking about what humans had in common to what makes each of us different. See, until about the 1960s, if you were thinking about human identity, you'd generally talk about human nature, those things that all of us make all of us human. But in the decades since, we found that when we talk about human identity, we nearly always and exclusively talk about human difference, the things that make us different from each other. We hold that the most important things about us are those things that make us different from others. And therefore, if we're going to reckon on our freedom, we have to think about our difference. I know the Christian Union have been asking students here in the run-up to this week, what makes you you? And if you were asked that question, it probably didn't cross your mind to say things like, well, I'm a brother, I'm a sister, I'm a son, I'm a daughter, unless there's something about your family that you think makes you different from everybody else. Much more common in the answers were those experiences, those tastes, those passions, those quirks that are unique to us. Those are the things that make me me. Those are the things that make me valuable. Those are the things I've got to factor in if I'm to be free. So that's the first shift. The second shift has been where we look to understand who we really are. And that shift has come from looking to others to looking within instead. In other words, we've come to believe that no one is better placed to tell us who each of us are than ourselves as individuals. No one is better placed to tell you who you are than you. And that's because our culture holds that our true self is sort of buried deep within us. And only each of us can uncover that from within us and let it shine so that we might be set free. And so for that reason, within our culture, we are very suspicious of anybody telling us who we really are. We're very suspicious of that because we think that will tie us up in chains. That will be the opposite of being free. You'll just find your individuality suppressed. And so it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks, you and you only have the right to define who you are. Here's how one of the great philosophers of the age puts it. No right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. We find freedom untethered from the expectations of others. And do you know what? You know this, all of you know this, because you're the generation that grew up singing High School Musical songs in the playground, which is all about breaking free. Troy breaks free when he shrugs off. There's quite a lot of love for High School Musical in the tent. Bit of a surprise. Troy breaks free when he shrugs off the expectation of his dad and his mates and goes to the audition. Gabriella breaks free as she gets over her inhibitions and does what she loves. And when they both break free together, wonderful things happen, don't they? Remember what they sing? You know, the world, it sees us in a way that's different from who we are. What poetry? And yet, Troy and Gabriella are heroes, aren't they? Because they dare to break free. Can you imagine? It wouldn't have been a heroic ending to the film, would it? If they'd said, oh, do you know what, Dad? You're right. I'll do what you want. You're heroic when you break free, when you have the courage to go by what you want, particularly when people criticize you, particularly when it costs you. Now, in a moment, I'm going to critique this whole approach. But clearly, these shifts haven't been all bad. In particular, they've created space for those who just a few decades ago might have felt that they needed to keep certain things about themselves buried deep inside. And the erosion of some stereotypes and the breaking of some often quite unreasonable parental expectations, for instance, on younger people is in part due to this movement. Perhaps most significantly of all, I think, those who've genuinely felt that they should conceal and don't feel are genuinely more able to talk about their feelings, their troubles, their concerns, their passions. And I've got to say, that has proved wonderfully humanizing. Recently, I read about John Stuart Mill, the thinker who grew up in a society when it just wasn't considered proper to talk about your feelings. And in his early 20s, Mill had an experience which he later called a crisis in my mental history. Probably what we today would call a nervous breakdown. And yet the tragedy was he felt that he couldn't talk about it with anyone. Perhaps the most heartbreaking line in his diary, he writes, "I should not have been left in the condition that I am if I had spoken of my griefs with another." And so listen, we should be genuinely grateful that we live in a permissive culture that allows us to talk about our deep feelings and struggles, and which doesn't insist that we carry them alone. That said, I do think that there are big problems with our culture's approach to individuality that I've described, what some thinkers call expressive individualism. And indeed, I want to suggest this lunchtime that this approach actually takes us away from enjoying our individuality, and even it takes us away from experiencing the freedom that we so deeply crave. Let me just very briefly outline 4 of these problems. This is going to be flying through, be a little simplistic, but we can revisit this in question times if you want. Here's the first problem. We lack stability in our identity. See, if we find our identity only through looking within, can you see how fragile our identities will always be? And it's fragile because there's no limits that we can ever place on ourselves. No rights, no wrongs, no rules for me sounds quite sophisticated, sounds quite freeing and exciting. But here's the thing, in a world of infinite choice, you have no friend to guide you, and each of us must figure out the very deepest things about our identity by ourselves alone. Let me say, as I talk to people, and actually as I look at my own experience, that doesn't lead to freedom, that leads to exhaustion. Because the demanding questions that you must ask of yourself never stop. Have I really understood myself well enough? Am I really sure I know who I really am? Am I being true to myself? And it never stops. See, life isn't like the movies, is it? In many films, including in High School Musical, the central protagonists look inside to figure out what they really want, and they have a battle and they go for it. But when they've figured it out and they have what they want, they're free and happy forever. You break free once and you're free forever. But reality isn't like that, is it? And it can't be, because unlike in the movies, we never know when we've truly arrived. We continually ask ourselves who we really are, what our true identity is. But like some Greek tragedy, every time we think that we've drained the question dry, it just reemerges again. Here's the second problem. It provides too simplistic an identity. See, culture tells you, look in, find your deepest desires, go for them. But it assumes that our desires never shift over time. They're perfectly ordered and they never compete. But isn't that too simplistic? Our desires aren't that ordered or sustained. They're in flux, they change all the time, they're chaotic. Elsa sings about the storm raging on after she's let it go. And we don't need Disney characters to see the same tendency in each of us, do we? Think about it very trivially in what you choose to eat. I love pizza and I love ice cream. I would happily eat pizza and ice cream for the rest of my life. But this thing happens, it's probably not happened to most of you yet. Your metabolism begins to slow down, in your mid-20s. And you have to think carefully about what you're going to eat. You can't both eat unlimited amounts of pizza and ice cream and be healthy and have a good body. So what do I do when my desires are discordant? Which is the desire that I follow in order to experience freedom? Or think about life after graduation. What path will you follow that will set you free? Part of you desires the job in the city with the money and the kudos. Part of you wants enough time in your life to keep up sport and see friends and have a meaningful romantic relationship. So which route leads to freedom? Which allows you to be true to yourself? And if you're faced with a situation when you genuinely can't have it all, can you ever be free? You might know the song Move by Saint Motel. If you do know, it's because it's the title music to FIFA 17. And here are the opening lyrics of the song, okay? This man, this dutiful man, has got this sense of devotion. I won't do that anymore. This sense of devotion. But one look, one touch of a hand can set the spiral in motion. I want it, can't have it. Oh, I can hardly stand it. Oh, what's a man to do? Great question. Because isn't it naive to think that once you've got what you currently desire most, that once you've got it, nothing will ever compete with that you desire? No, the storm just rages on. The storm rages on. Thirdly, this view of identity is crushing. We think if I'm just me as I want to be, I'm able to shrug off the demands of others, whether that's parents or society or whatever. But if you believe that you must essentially create your own identity, then the onus is on you to create an identity for yourself that you're proud of, that is worth celebrating. A friend of mine has come from an extremely privileged background. He had everything thrown at him whilst he was growing up. And his parents paid for him to have the very best schooling. And he told me that the strength of his school was that it encouraged a really wide range of aspirations, not just in the range of academic subjects, but also in the arts and in sport. And I remember in one conversation he told me, the ethos of my school was this: find the thing in the world that you enjoy the most, and then become the very best in the world at it. Now, can you see that at the very same time that is the most inspiring and crushing of school ethoses? But all of us know that to some extent. If my identity is a blank canvas that I have to paint for myself, I live in constant fear, because what if I paint a stroke that I later regret? What if I commit myself to a path that I don't want to be on later? Again, it's exhausting, and some of you know this. It's exhausting. I'm an emotional yo-yo, because when I've had a good day and I'm doing well and I'm encouraged, that's great. But I'm devastated when I feel as though I've painted myself, my identity, into a corner. Here's how the social psychologist Heidi Grant describes it. She says, "You must be perfectly awesome in order to keep believing that you are. So you live in a quiet terror of making mistakes and feel devastated when you do. Your only defense is to refocus your attention on all the things you do well, mentally stroking your own ego until it's forgotten the horrible episode of unawesomeness and moved on to something more satisfying." And she says, when you think about it, this doesn't exactly sound like a recipe for success, does it? Psychiatrist Glenn Harrison adds these provocative questions. What if our inner hero turns out to be elusive? What if the self that we discover within turns to be weak, vulnerable, and dependent? See, if I'm looking to myself to carve out my own identity, the likelihood is I'm just going to be crushed and exhausted by the weight of my own expectations. Fourthly, this view of identity damages relationships. Of course it does. Of course relationships suffer in this mode. Because it's hard to care very deeply about others, isn't it, if you're thinking this much about yourself? It's as if your emotional resources have all already been spent. But also, just as significantly, this way of living causes us to make decisions that fragment relationships. The singer Tom Petty died, a couple of months ago, and his song Free Fallin', which you might know as a John Mayer cover, encapsulates this. And the phrase free falling is poetically used. This time it is genuine poetry, right? It's poetically used in two senses. The singer is free falling in the sense that he says, I'm not attached to anyone. I'm free. I'm free to live my girlfriend who wants me to settle down too soon, which is what the song's about. But he says, I'm also free falling in the sense that in pursuing freedom and in pursuing experience and doing what I desire above all in this moment, I've sacrificed meaningful connection with this woman that I love. And the final verse closes poignantly like this. I want to free fall out into nothing. Going to leave this world for a while. The singer is saying, look, I pursued freedom and experience, and they were the things that brought me into this relationship with this woman. but they're also the things that are causing me to flee from it and from her. And as the song closes, he's left lonely, without the courage to return, but also with this ongoing impetus to keep pursuing freedom and experience, even if he senses that ultimately he'll fall into nothing. So here's the question. Has our culture's big story really caused our individuality to thrive? Has it? I don't think so. I don't think we're any clearer on what makes me me. We've exchanged the very high expectations of others on our lives for our own expectations on our lives, and they are just as heavy, just as crippling. Some of us have lost relationships that we care about deeply through this model. And so we're right to ask, is there an alternative? See, there are times, aren't there, where we know that an external word about our identity is vital. So what, think about the Bourne Identity, classic, all right? You think Jason would never have worked out who he really was if you just locked him in a room and told him to journal until he found himself. But what about when it comes to making sense of our own deep desires? Doesn't that feel riskier? And here's why it's risky, because we ask the question, who can tell me which of my desires are authentic to the real me, and which are worth pursuing, and which are damaging? Who knows me well enough? Now, clearly, if God is there, he can speak into these questions. If he made humanity, he made each of us. And so he can help us understand which of our desires are fruitful, which are harmful. But also, the more we experience our humanness, the more we make sense of our own individuality. And yet, and do you know what? I can see this in the body language of some of you. You bristle at that. We bristle at the thought of letting God speak into our individuality. Why? Because we imagine that God, if he is there, probably isn't that committed to our individuality. And probably isn't that committed to our thriving. Remember the phrase from My Way. Do you remember what Frank sang? If you're one that kneels, you got naught. Let me humbly suggest that the problem is we think of some generic God. It's hard to believe that a remote being, a being who's just omniscient and omnipresent and omnipotent, could ever be committed to our freedom, isn't it? But for a moment, just assume with me that the Christian account of reality is true. And that the Creator, the one true God, has been revealed in human time and space by Jesus. In front of you, you've got a copy of Luke's Gospel. And if you've not taken one away already this week, then please do. It's one of the early accounts of Jesus' life. We won't turn to the page because we've got two different copies with two different covers, and it'll get too confusing finding it. But in chapter 19, Jesus explains in verse 10 in one sentence why he's come. And he says it's for this reason, that he's come to seek and to save the lost. In other words, Jesus is saying, I've come to find people in a way that they can never find themselves. And as you read on in the gospel, you find that Jesus is so committed to that end, he will purchase it at the cost of his own life. That's how committed he is. Now, I realize there are questions here buzzing around, but for a minute, just ask this. What if the one true God loves you so much that he would die for you? What if he was so committed to you that he would take upon himself all of the guilt you have incurred and all the hurt you have caused through chasing the wrong desires in your heart? What if he was willing to take them upon himself? What if his death really is the means of your forgiveness? What if his death is an invite into the only relationship which can satisfy the deepest desires that you have forever? Wouldn't that be the kind of God that you can trust is for you? Even when it comes to holding out to him your most tender desires? Listen, I'm not wanting to pretend that it's easy to hand your life over to Jesus. It isn't. Sometimes it feels like death. But knowing that he loves you makes all the difference when it comes to that surrender. You can trust that what he's doing is for your freedom, whatever he asks. Let me also say, I think this is really important, that knowing his love is also enough to end the exhaustion. Because you don't have to strain anymore. You're loved. In one of my most favourite verses, Jesus puts it like this. He offers this invitation. Come to me. That includes Durham students. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. See, it's in this context of knowing that you are most deeply loved as you are, that you can discover your true individuality. And knowing that you're loved in this way frees you to look away from yourself to the needs of others. You can start, in the language of the Bible, to consider yourself with sober judgment. That with the help of other people, you can think about what you can personally offer to the world, knowing all the time that you're not defined and your value doesn't depend upon what you do. And so it turns out that the precise picture of what it means to follow Jesus is as different as the range of humanity itself. Yes, Jesus insists that reality has a shape to it. Yes, Jesus addresses us, not as people who are fundamentally different from each other, but as part of a broader humanity. But also the colours that shine through the prism of our own individuality are entirely unique. And so I want to suggest this lunchtime that following Jesus makes you more and not less individual, even at the same time bonding you more closely and not further away from other people. We're bonded together in love. We're part of the same body, and we're part of a common humanity. We've all seen, haven't we, the hopeless X Factor auditionee who's cut down by Simon Cowell. And even though he's right, we kind of think he's brutal, don't we, to burst his bubble in that way. I think some of us instinctively imagine God to be this kind of cosmic Simon Cowell who makes a judgment on our lives. And deep down we say, look, God, you might even be right in what you're saying about me, but why are you so brutal? At the same time, don't we also think that the hapless auditionee should have never got to the point of auditioning? If only they'd been a friend or a family member who put their arm around that person and said, listen, I love you as you are really not that tuneful. Let the dream die. Find your niche elsewhere. Let me say that is Jesus, the God who puts an arm around your shoulder, and not who only puts an arm around your shoulder, but who also takes your failure and your guilt onto his shoulder and deals with it at the cross. He's the God who loves you so much that he's secured your eternal forgiveness. But he's also the God who loves you so much that he doesn't want to leave you as you are. Jesus says he wants to find us. He wants to make each of us more fully us. That comes in relationship with him. And that's why only true freedom and individuality can be found in his love. Looking forward to your questions. I think Sophie's going to explain how we're going to hear them.
Pete, thank you very much for that. Thank you to you guys for texting in questions. We've got about 10 minutes for some of those. So going to kick off with one which says, if God loves me, why won't he give me what I want as long as it's not contrary to the teachings of the Bible?
When you're a parent, you'll understand the answer to that. Isn't that true? Do I really love Samuel and Toby through always giving them what they desire the most? No, I often will indicate my love for them through giving them what they desire the most in that moment. But sometimes, actually, as a parent, I realise that I need to aspire for them greater desires than they have for themselves. And so very often, and to be honest, when you look back on your life, even if you've had a very hard life, you'll be able to look back at a world which is full of good things. And they're just little shards of God's kindness to you. But just as you would say to a child, you need to trust your parent on this sometimes. So Jesus encourages us to trust our Heavenly Father, that he really has what will bring our greatest flourishing, our greatest maturity to us.
Thanks, Pete. I'm really happy to take questions from the floor as well. We'd love this to be a discussion. So if you'd like to stick up a hand, we've got someone down here to bring a microphone round to you. I'll stick with the phone for now, but it's welcome to have an opportunity for that in a minute. Next question says, can I not still have my personal identity and believe in God? Why do I have to give myself to God? Don't I have free will? The second one.
Can I not still have my personal identity and believe in God? Why don't I have to give myself to God? Don't I have free will? Yes, okay. I mean, what I was saying towards the end is you don't surrender your identity when you become a Christian. In fact, the things that inhibit you from showing the most beautiful things of your story, your personality, what you can contribute, are taken away. Which is why, actually, as you look around, I hope your Christian friends, you do see they're all quite different from each other. That's healthy. Certainly, the vast way of serving that Christians have been involved in, to put what's on this week, I mean, it's just been mind-blowing to see. And so I want to say that actually following Jesus makes you more individual and more able to bring your capacities and not less. Do you have free will? Certainly the Bible would say we're not robots. We have real responsibility. We have free hearts to which we can apportion certain values in the way that we live. But I think what I was saying is towards the end, and what I've hoped to describe this week in various ways is that Christianity is not encouraging you to take a leap from reality, but to embrace reality. And therefore, in order to be truly yourself, you have to step into the shape of that reality. And if there is a God who is there, and if he is a God who made you for relationship, then you're no more free out of relationship with him than the fish is when it leaps out of the river in the name of freedom. Oh, it's so oppressive to be in the river. Why can't I be on the towpath? Okay, if the environment that we were made for was a relational environment, relationships with each other, and supremely to rest our hearts in a relationship with a God of love, then it's no surprise that we're most supremely free, and our individuality, our responsibility, the freedom that we have to make decisions and to value certain things is found within that environment.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you for continuing to text in questions. We're going to take another one which says, what if my identity isn't compatible with the Bible, brackets LGBT+?
Thank you for asking the question. What we've said throughout this week is that there is no such thing as pure experience. Like, all of us are interpreters, okay? We all have to make sense of the things that we read and the things that we see, the relationships we're part of, the desires that we experience. None of those things come with a value label attached to them, okay? And so all of us have to interpret the world that we live in. All of us have to interpret the things that we feel according to some sort of lens. And you can't not do that. There's no such thing as pure experience. Now, when it comes to certain things that we feel and certain desires, it may feel very instinctively obvious that freedom is found in following them. But at the same time, there is a lens there by which we're making sense of what we experience. Okay. And what I'm suggesting is that actually Jesus' lens on reality, though it will be challenging to all of us in various ways, if he really is the God of love, then we can trust him when it comes to even bringing the most precious aspects of our humanity to him. Now, I don't want for a moment to pretend that's easy for anyone. It's not easy in the realm of sexuality. It's not easy in any sort of realm, actually. It's not easy with your bank balance. But if Jesus truly is committed to our flourishing, and as we saw a couple of days ago, if we have the humility to say that our judgment and our culture's judgment may be wrong on certain things, then we can surrender even those deepest aspects of our personality to him, knowing that he's for our best. Now, that might seem completely implausible to you, and I'm not going to say any more on that at this point, because there's a tendency in this setting to talk over each other, to miss what each other are saying. And so rather than to just kind of have the equivalent of just tweeting memes at each other, let's talk about these things, okay? I think we can learn tremendous things from the perspectives of each other.
Thanks, Pete. We're nearly at 10 to 2, so I'm going to break there for the end of our first bit. Can I say, we'd love to stay in touch with you or just to hear your feedback, so please do fill in one of the Connect cards that are on your tables or on your seats and give those to one of the stewards who will be holding a box as you go out. I've also got 2 books to recommend, which are available on our bookstore in the cafe. One of them is What Makes Us Human? Subtitle and other questions about God, Jesus, and human identity. So if you'd find that interesting, that's a short little book. Please do take it away for free. I've also got The Case for Christ, which is a journalist who set out to disprove God and ended up writing a book about why he believed in Christ. So if that's interesting to you, please do go to the bookstall at the back and have a look at those. Our cafe is open for the afternoon, so please do hang out there, grab a coffee if you'd like to. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming. We'll come back together again in about a minute. There's going to be doors on both sides that you can exit from. Thank you. Okay, we're going to come back together there. I'll start with questions from the phone again. We will bring round a roving mic if you'd like to do that as well. Pete, can we ask, do you think that if your freedom is impinged on by others or dependent on them, be it by God or by friends, that it can still be called freedom? If your freedom is impinged on by others or it's dependent on them?
If your freedom is impinged on by others. All right, I think I understand this question. If I don't and you asked it, then follow up in a minute. Much of the difficulty with our culture is thinking about freedom. And this is partly because of these twin sort of things that I described at the beginning, trends since the 1960s, is that we tend to think of ourselves as sort of free-floating individuals. Okay, and therefore, when we talk about freedom, we tend to use language which is, freedom is not being interfered upon by somebody else. Now, clearly, there's an aspect to freedom which is right there. All right, okay, we'll try this. All right, Shawshank Redemption. Are the people inside Shawshank Penitentiary free? No, of course they're not free, okay, because they're in prison and they have abusive prison officers. And so part of the hellish nature of Shawshank is that it's so demeaning, okay? You can't look at those prisoners and say that they're free. How about this question? When the prisoners are outside of Shawshank, are they free? Now, it seems to me that that is actually the whole question of the Shawshank Redemption. Okay, what does redemption mean? Redemption is when you pay a price to set somebody free. And the interesting question about the Shawshank Redemption is, well, who redeems who? And it's Andy Dufresne who redeems Red, the guy played by Morgan Freeman. How does he redeem him? How does he really set him free? Here's how he does it. Do you remember early on in the film, well, about halfway through the film, a prisoner called Brooks is freed. But he's been so institutionalized within the prison, but also all of his mates are within the prison, that when he's set free, he doesn't know how to deal with it. For the first time in decades, Brooks can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. But his freedom is untethered. He has no hope for the future. He has no solid identity. And ultimately, he has no kind of social network, but you know what I mean by that. He has no friendship group in which he can experience his freedom. And so, do you remember, and this is the beauty of this, well, one of the bits of beauty of the Shawshank Redemption. Here's how Andy Dufresne redeems Red. Do you remember, I can't remember the name of the village in Mexico, one of you will tell me afterwards, that Andy Dufresne says, it begins with a Z, that when I'm free, that's where I'm going to go in Mexico. It's this beautiful place. I'm going to have a place on the beach. I'm going to repair boats. And he keeps talking about this place, partly for his own hope. But then in one of the most tender points of the film, he invites Red, Morgan Freeman, to come and join him there. Do you remember early on in the film, Red has described himself as the man within Shawshank who knows how to get things. That's how he describes himself. And when one of the tenderest moments, Andy Dufresne says to Red, you know, in Mexico, I could really do with a fellow who knows how to get things. How does Andy Dufresne free? How does he redeem Red? Not only through knowing that one day he will be out of Shawshank. He'll be free from all of those things that will impinge upon his freedom. But that's not enough. Brooks had that. To have true freedom, you can't only be freed from oppressive things, but you also have to be freed to an environment that will lead to your flourishing. It's the same thing with a fish, isn't it? Okay? A fish that is completely just a robot isn't free, but equally a fish that takes its leap out of freedom onto the towpath isn't free either. And therefore, the picture of freedom that the Bible gives us is, yes, absolutely, to be free, you need to be away from the despotic influences on your life, the Shawshanks of your life. But that's not enough. You've also got to be invited into a place where you can know your true identity, where you can be valued for what you bring, where you're loved as where you are, for who you are, and where you have a hope. And so just freedom from isn't enough. That's Brooks. You've also got to be invited into an environment that makes sense of your reality, who you really are. That's quite a long answer. And if you've not seen The Shawshank Redemption, you're a moron. And it might also mean nothing to you. But hopefully that gives you enough. Yeah.
Thanks, Pete. Would anyone like to come back on that from the floor? Or to ask another question? Okay. Do you think our identity is defined by death, as this is how we are remembered? So surely we have no freedom of our final identity, as someone else decides how we are remembered.
Can I see that again? Flipping out, these are hard. I've said several times, you know, these are good. Do you think our identity is defined by death? Is this how that would be awful, wouldn't it? If actually our identity was only how we'd be remembered in the future, that would be dreadful. For one thing, inaccuracies are told, aren't they? For the most part, you're just forgotten. All right, even if you win a Nobel Prize, probably all your great-grandchildren will know about you in the future as you won a Nobel Prize. I mean, that is an awful thing, isn't it? And you would say, okay, even if I've won a Nobel Prize, and even if I gave my life's work to winning the Nobel Prize, there's more to me than being a Nobel Prize winner. So let me just do the second part. So we have no freedom. So if and we thought about this using the metaphor of Monopoly and poker on Monday. Okay. We're stuck, if that's the case, with an identity which doesn't last and which doesn't seem to be big enough to describe who we really are. Now, tomorrow we're going to think then, and even as I'm talking, and I feel this within myself, even as I'm talking then, I think, no, there's got to be something more to me that lasts than just that. Okay? Even if I also look to my sons and I say, well, there's an element of, my DNA being passed on to them. And even if I look at all of the people that I'll impact in their life and the incremental differences that I make to their lives, good and bad, I probably don't feel as though that ascribes the depth for which I long to have a legacy. Now, tomorrow we're going to think about that, because that is a human need. It's a human desire to want to have a legacy. And actually, all of us live as though we have a legacy. Actually, all of us live as though our life will be significant more than just the brief years that we have here. Tomorrow, we're going to think about where that is. Could be a psychological crutch. Could be. Or it could be because, as one of the Old Testament writers wrote more than 3,000 years ago, that God has set eternity within the hearts of humans. Now, we're going to see the answer to that is whether or not Jesus was physically resurrected from the dead. If Jesus was physically resurrected from the dead, then the idea of life after death is not a psychological crutch, because there is at least one human who experienced life after death. Oh, and by the way, that human claims that if you trust him, he can secure your life after death as well. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then I'm afraid to say your desire for legacy is condemned to be that experience. And there'll be a significant dissonance between what you hope for and the way that you live. But as we'll see tomorrow, I really believe that you can be a thinking student, even a Durham student, and believe that God raised Jesus from the dead. And that makes and sense of and harmonizes a whole number of our deep desires. I'm sorry, that feels like not a very good answer, but it's quite a philosophical question. And so if I've completely missed that, I studied philosophy at Masters, and I love talking about philosophy, so come and bless me.
Feel free to text in a follow-up if you'd like to as well. For the moment, we're going to look at probably the shortest question I've been texted all day. Not going to be the simplest answer, but if God has a plan for us, how can we have free will?
We talked about this a couple of days ago, I think. Christianity is what's known as an interfaith religion. I'm saying that clearly because it's not interfaith, although it does have important things to say about interfaith matters. But it's known technically as an interfaith, CE, religion. In other words, what Christianity claims to bring together is two things that are categorically different from one another. All right, you come across this all the time in Christianity. So, the Bible, as we saw on Tuesday, 100% written by human authors who volitionally wrote by themselves, but also claims to be the Word of God. And it's not 50% of each, it's 100% of both together. Jesus speaks as though he is fully human and is also fully God. Okay, not 50% human, 50% God. He is 100% God and 100% human. You're saying, this addles my brain. Absolutely. Okay. And there are ways in which you can dig into this, but there's mystery. Okay. Here is another one. God, 100% sovereign over his world. People like you and me, 100% responsible for the values that we place on things and the decisions that we make. Okay. I talk about, with students, I sometimes talk about these as 200% truths. Okay. It's 100% of both at the same time. And there is mystery here again, but I do want you to at least see that chapter after chapter in the Bible, and sometimes even within the same verse, you have the Bible writers just assuming that both of these are true. Let me give a couple of examples. You might have seen the story of Joseph, he of Technicolor Dreamcoat fame. Okay, now you can read about his story towards the end of the very first book of the Bible called Genesis. And you might remember that his brothers, his 11 brothers, well, 10 of them are there at the time, sell him into slavery, and dreadful things happen to him whilst he's in Egypt. And then after their father Jacob dies, these brothers are worried. Okay, Joseph seems to have been nice to them up to this point, but now dad's gone, maybe Joseph will let his true colours show, no pun intended. And Joseph says a fascinating thing. He says, you intended it for harm. Okay, so he's saying what you did had intentions that were harmful. You were 100% guilty for what you did. But God intended it for good, for the saving of many lives. You might remember that Joseph goes on to become the equivalent of prime minister in Egypt and is able to make a tremendous difference in many ways there. You supremely see this in the death of Jesus. If you're to understand the death of Jesus rightly, you have to hold two things together. One, that humanity is 100% culpable for crucifying the perfect embodiment of love in human form. Okay? Humanity are guilty for the death of Jesus. But also that as part of God's great plan, he knit that into the tapestry of human history so that Jesus' death on the cross could be the means by which forgiveness is offered to the world. And so the very first day of the church, you can read about it in Acts chapter 2, Peter puts it in this way. He says that God handed him over to you by his set foreknowledge. In other words, God was completely in control of what was going on, but you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death through nailing him to the cross. Who's responsible for the death of Jesus then? Humanity responsible? Absolutely. Is that within the sovereignty of God? Absolutely. Now, there are a million questions that come out of that. But let me just mention one. It means that even the most direst of circumstances in your life is not beyond the reach and the healing and the blessing of God. And sometimes God even uses our direst circumstances, as we thought about yesterday, as the means of being a blessing to the world. I'll stop there.
Again, if you'd like to come back on that, do follow up. I've had one just come in which says, if any religion could strengthen my identity, and technically it doesn't matter if I'm Jewish, Christian or Muslim, etc. in this argument.
Completely. And I'm not saying you should become a Christian because it's like the ultimate pep talk. What I am saying is Christianity is true. I believe the Christian story of reality makes way more sense than any other story of reality. Okay, we've been saying that every day this week. Other stories completely fail in certain areas to describe human reality as we see it and experience it. And I can come back to some of those if we want to otherwise. The reason that you should become a Christian is not because it's of immense therapeutic benefit. However, because Christianity is true and it makes the deepest sense of who you really are, it is not surprising that when you surrender your life to Jesus, there is amazing therapeutic benefit. Let me add this as well. You don't become a Christian in order to have good therapy, because the authentic Christian experience is not good therapy. It's that in knowing that you have everything in Jesus, you're willing to lose everything. And I bet you've seen that in some of your Christian friends. They do things which are so risky, which are so bold, which are so loving. And you find yourself thinking, why are you doing this? You could have a much more comfortable life. You could have a much quieter life. And so you're actually freed for a life where you give yourself to others, where you give yourself to the good of the world, not because it will do anything for you, but because that's who you were made to be. And so, therefore, the authentic Christian experience is not just knowing the preciousness of God's love, but in knowing the preciousness of God's love, you're willing to die to yourself and give yourself to others. Now, you could still say, well, I'm cynical. And maybe you're even finding therapy and doing good things for other people and for the good of the world. Yeah, maybe you're right. Apart from if Jesus rose from the dead, in which case, it's true. And therefore it has therapeutic benefit because it's true, and Christians don't look to it just because of the therapeutic benefit that they find. And so please come back tomorrow. We really are going to look, probably the most objectively time for the week, as to whether the idea that God really rose Jesus from the dead counts. As we saw yesterday with Luc Ferry, he said, the Christian story is unlike any other story. It's so good in the way that it makes a sense of our world, of our suffering and pain and mortality particularly. He says, I can't believe it. He ultimately, I guess, believes that Christianity is just positive psychology. I want to say it's good because it's true.
Thank you, Pete. I've got 2 more questions that I want to come to. But before that also, thanks to somebody who's texted in a few, one of which says, where does the Christian worldview succeed in explaining the world in ways that other religions fail to do? Which, again, I would reiterate, as Pete was saying, come back tomorrow for lunchtime on that, where we'll be talking about.
Can I just say something on that, though? We touched a bit on that on Monday. I think the question, the audio or video is being put up. Atheism is hopeless at making sense of the way that you actually live your life day to day. Hopeless. You live as though your life isn't an accident. You live as though things matter, not just within the constructs of your own life or within society's values, but as they really matter, big R, big M. You live as though love is more than just, it can be boiled down to a chemical reaction in the brain. Atheism is hopeless, actually, at giving us a vocabulary for the depth of experience that we have. And actually, what's been interesting in most of the people I talked to this week, which I realise is quite a self-selecting group, but most people have come to me and said, yeah, atheism is hopeless, isn't it? So I'm kind of thinking, well, why Christianity? But it's not atheism, is it? There's somebody, I'm just looking to see if they're here. I don't think so. Came to me and said, okay, I'm a reluctant atheist. And that was a great way of putting it. And he felt a cognitive dissonance between what atheism says about what the world is like and what and how it describes human experience and the richness of human life that he has. So, but we will come back to that tomorrow. Sorry for cutting you off, Sophie.
Thanks. I've got a text from one of our team, which is just saying there are videos of the talks on the Human website. Unfortunately, we don't have Monday lunchtime on there, and I'm really sorry about that. But we do have videos of many of the other talks, so check those out. I have 2 questions. I might pitch both of them to you, and then, yeah. One, which is just saying, if God is a God of love, then why does the Bible tell us to be God-fearing? And then, finally, one, personally, what have you found the most freeing about being a Christian?
I'll do them in order. On Tuesday, we talked about how we can misunderstand the Bible, and actually quite a lot of our anger sometimes is because we've just misheard what the Bible is saying. And the word fear there is one of those. When we're told to be afraid of God, I suppose it means a couple of things. One, it means that ultimately it is his universe that we live in, and therefore we will all give an account before him. And therefore to live in his world as if he doesn't exist is the Bible would say is folly. However, if you're a Christian and you've come to know God, you come to understand who he really is, that he is a God of love. He's a God of love who, because he's a God of love, will ensure that justice is done in his world. But he is perfect, blazing love. Now, in what sense do we fear him? One of the Old Testament sages says that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Do you see what that's saying? If you want to be really wise, fear God. But it doesn't mean being afraid of him. That word fear has the sense of being awed by the sense of magnitude. And so just as if you were standing at the bottom of a mountain, you might just be awed by its magnitude. You're put in its place. The Bible would say you fear the mountain. You're not frightened it's going to fall on you, but you fear it. And therefore, what that verse is saying and what the question is getting at is, if you want to live really wisely, if you want to live a truly free life, then you need to allow God to expand his place in your horizon to the sort of magnitude that he belongs to have. And that will cause you to live wisely and to live a life which is truly free. Doesn't mean cowering from him. If you've been made right with him through his death on the cross, you have nothing to fear. But you're called to grow in a relationship with him as he really is. And the God as he really is not some kind of little God that you can put in a cardboard box under the cupboard. He wants all of you. He wants all of your life. The second one, what have I found most freeing? I hope that I intimated at it in the message that I gave, which is an end to the exhaustion. I am a very competitive person. I like succeeding. I like winning. I like getting things my own way. I like achieving. I love being able to look back on a day and say, do you know what, I've made that count. And that drivenness at times ran me into the ground. And so to come to a point where I was able to hear God say, I don't need you. I love you. I managed to run the world pretty well up until before you were born. And I managed to do my mission within my church pretty well before the day you became a Christian. It is truly freeing to be able to say no to certain things. It is truly freeing to know that when things don't go as well as I hope they would, that my identity is deeper than them. I've got to say, I don't think I could stand in this environment and do what I'm doing today. Some of you have scowled at me at some of these answers. And the truth is, I don't know that I could have stood here and received this sort of critical feedback. And the reason why your Christian friends have gone out on a limb and inviting some of you here today is because they know they're deeply loved as they are. And that they love you. But that frees me then to do things in a context where I know, do you know what, I'm doing the right thing and this is not making me fans. This isn't necessarily making me popular. Do you know what, that is an incredible place to be. I'm loved as I am, deeply forever. And on the days when I don't even feel that, I look to a God who demonstrates his love for me on the cross. And says, he has truly demonstrated his love for me. That's enough to humble me on my good days in a helpful way. That's enough to pick me up off the floor on my bad days.
Pete, thank you so much. I have had a few more questions, but I think we're going to break there just because I don't want to keep everybody. If you feel like your question hasn't been answered, please do come and talk to Pete at the end or grab one of the people in the dark blue human jumpers. Most of them are people who work for local churches. They'd be really happy to be a listening ear. They're really used to discussing these kind of topics. So do grab one of them. Otherwise, our cafe is open. Thank you so much for coming. Please do look at our bookstall that's at the back. You're welcome to look at the books which are there. They are free to browse and free to take. Do fill in Connect cards, and please do come back to our future events. Thank you so much.